Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about gardening, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is September 21st. Today in Botanical History, we celebrate an English writer, an American businessman and horticulturist, and an American writer and celebrity. We'll hear an excerpt from a top-rated book that became a hit movie starring Eric Bana and Rachel McAdams. And we grow that garden library today with a book that features the true story of leaving behind a beloved garden and then starting another. And finally, we'll wrap things up with the birthday of a prolific American writer. And I've pulled together some garden-inspired excerpts from his many, many books. So fun. But before we get to all of that, here's today's curated news. Well, today's curated news is very timely. The topic is pruning hydrangeas, and this is from an article that was written by Janet Carson over at Fine Gardening. The subtitle of this article is Knowing If Your Shrub Blooms on Old or New Wood. That's what's going to help you know when to prune your hydrangea so that you're doing it at the right time. Now, according to Janet, there are 3 reasons for why gardeners or people in general get confused about when to prune hydrangea. First, because they look dead in the winter. That confuses people. Because they sometimes fail to bloom in the summer. That can cause all kinds of questions. And then finally, because it's a shrub. And since it's a shrub, most people assume that it needs to be pruned. That said, hydrangeas don't need to be pruned at all. In fact, Janet points out that even though they can totally handle pruning, if you never prune a hydrangea, it'll be just fine. Well, now you might be thinking, well, then why would I ever prune a hydrangea? Let me give you an example. I have a hydrangea up at the cabin that is near the front door, and it was mammoth when we bought the cabin. And so to get it back under control, I gave it a severe pruning. And then I had a more normal-sized hydrangea to deal with the following spring. And so that's one reason you may want to prune it back. You know, I always tell my student gardeners, if you want your plant to grow, if you want to reinvigorate it, pruning is stimulation for the plant to get growing. Pruning sets in motion all kinds of growing activities on the part of the plant. But now let's circle back to what Janet's talking about here when it comes to pruning hydrangea. In this article, Janet divides the hydrangea into 2 camps. First, you have hydrangea that bloom on old wood, and these would include things like your big leaf hydrangea, your oak leaf hydrangea. Those are hydrangea that bloom on old growth, and they're easy because all you do is prune them after they've flowered. So the old saying, prune time follows bloom time, that works perfectly for them. Now, if you're unsure whether or not your hydrangea is blooming on old wood, Janet offers this tip. If you have a hydrangea that starts blooming in the early summer and then is kind of done by midsummer, maybe a sporadic bloom here or there, that's probably a hydrangea that's blooming on old wood. And so all you do is you wait for it to finish blooming, you cut off the old blooms, and there you go, you're done. Now, if you have a hydrangea that's blooming on new growth, you want to prune them very early in the spring before they get going, or very late in the fall before they go dormant. Now, if you're wondering how you can tell if your hydrangea blooms on new growth, ask yourself this question. Does the hydrangea that I'm thinking about start blooming in the middle of the summer and continue blooming until frost? If you're answering yes to that question, then you probably have a hydrangea that is blooming on new growth. Think of hydrangeas like the Botanical Hydrangea or the smooth hydrangea. Both of those bloom on new growth, on new wood. So again, you're going to prune those early in the spring before they even get going, or very late in the fall, right before they're going to go to bed for the winter. Now, there are two other tips that Janet offers if you're thinking about these hydrangeas that grow on new growth. If you want to get bigger flowers, Janet says, cut them all the way back, go to the ground with those babies, and next year you will have bigger flowers, especially with the smooth hydrangeas. They're going to give you a bigger bloom head if you go all the way back. On the other hand, if flopping is a bigger concern for you, if those large blooms get so heavy that they actually just kind of flop, especially if it rains, then what you're going to want to do is leave about 2 feet worth of stems and then cut them back to that point. Now, why are you going to do that? Well, essentially what you're doing is you are creating a little wooden framework for next year's growth to grow up through. Your own little trellis system using this year's old growth. Kind of clever. All right, well, I tell you what, we spent a ton of time talking about this today, but it's a timely topic. I know it's on a lot of people's minds, and how can it not be? Because hydrangeas are the star of the show right now. So if I didn't get all of your questions answered, or you want to dive in deeper to this article by Janet Carson, and she does a great job, and believe me, she offers way more information than I was able to offer here. I kind of gave you an abridged version. What you can do is head on over to the Facebook group for the show. Just search for the Daily Gardener Community. And then at the top, you'll see a little magnifying glass, and you can search for the word hydrangea. And Janet's post on pruning hydrangeas will pop right up. And if you're not in the group, don't worry about it. It is so easy to join. All you need to do is head on up to the search bar in Facebook, where you'd search for an old friend, type in the words Daily Gardener Community, and then answer a few questions and request to join. I'll see you in the group. It's time for today's Botanical History. Here's Botanical History for today, September 21st. Today is the birthday of Herbert George Wells, who went by H.G. Wells. He was the English writer, and he was born on this day in 1866. Although his work spanned many genres, he's remembered as one of the fathers of science fiction, along with Jules Verne and the publisher Hugo Gernsback. Now, growing up, H.G.'s father was a gardener, and that might be the reason why flowers have figured into so many of his books. In The Flowering of the Strange Orchid, his 1894 book, an orchid collector eventually dies. He's murdered by an orchid after cultivating an unknown predatory specimen that was found under the body of a dead plant explorer. And then in The History of Mr. Polly, that came out in 1910, the character of Uncle Penstemon was obviously named after a flower. In what would become his most famous book, The Time Machine, written in 1895, H.G. wrote these words, "And I have by me for my comfort 2 strange white flowers, shriveled now, and brown, and flat and brittle, to witness that even when mind and strength had gone, gratitude and a mutual tenderness still lived on in the heart of men." In The Secret Places of the Heart, another one of his books, H.G. wrote, All the English flowers came from Shakespeare. I don't know what we did before his time. And there is one final example of garden kismet for H.G. Wells. It turns out that he had a gardener. Her name was Ethelind Fearon, and she was also a writer in her spare time. H.G. once wrote, "Adapt or perish, now as ever, is nature's inexorable imperative." And today is the birthday of Robert Heister Montgomery. He was an American accountant, educator, and gardener, and he was born on this day in 1872. And when he wasn't busy co-founding the world's largest accounting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Robert worked with his favorite plants, conifers and tropical trees. In 1930, he set up a winter home in Florida, and then he began buying every type of palm tree that he could find growing in the state. His impressive collection of over 700 trees inspired him to call his place the Coconut Grove Palmedum. And in 1936, Robert founded the Fairchild Tropical Garden in Coconut Grove, Florida. 7 years later, Robert died after one of his daily walks with his wife Nell beneath his beloved palm trees. Today, the Palmedum property is known as the Montgomery Botanical Center in honor of Robert Heister Montgomery. And today is the birthday of the American actress, comedian, and author Fannie Flagg, who was born on this day, September 21st, in 1944. Now, depending on how old you are, you may remember that Fannie Flagg was a semi-regular panelist on the TV game show Match Game. Remember that? But did you know that Fannie Flagg also wrote Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe? It was a hit book that came out in 1987, and it was made into the movie Fried Green Tomatoes that came out in 1991. Now, her latest book, The Wonder Boy of Whistle Stop, came out in 2020, and it's about the power of returning to your roots. Now, incidentally, Fannie is a daughter of the great state of Alabama, but today she writes her books out among her flowers in her California garden. It helps her clear her mind. And for the show today, I thought I'd share this little excerpt from Fannie's 2014 book, The All-Girl Filling Station's Last Reunion. It's a little excerpt about the natural beauty of Fairhope, Alabama, a place that Fannie Flagg saw when she was a little girl. Here's what she wrote. They had arrived on a warm, balmy evening, and the soft night air had been filled with the scent of honeysuckle and wisteria. She could still remember coming down the hill and seeing the lights of Mobile, sparkling and twinkling across the water, just like a jeweled necklace. It was as if they had just entered into a fairyland. The Spanish moss hanging from the trees had looked bright silver in the moonlight and made dancing shadows all along the road. And the shrimp boats out in the bay, with their little blinking green lights, had looked just like Christmas. It's time for Unearthed Words. Today's Unearthed Words come to us from the writer Audrey Niffenegger. This is an excerpt from her best-selling book and a sentimental favorite of mine, The Time Traveler's Wife. What's the date? September 8th, 1998. Where are you from? Next July. We sit down at the table. Kimmy is doing the New York Times crossword puzzle. What's going on next July? It's been a very cool summer. Your garden's looking good. All the tech stocks are up. You should buy some Apple stock in January. She makes a note on a piece of brown paper bag. Okay, and you? How are you doing? How's Claire? You guys got a baby yet? It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Uprooted by Paige Dickey. This book came out in 2020. I bought my copy last November, and the subtitle is A Gardener Reflects on Beginning Again. When Margaret Roach reviewed this book, she wrote, an intimate, lesson-filled story of what happens when one of America's best-known garden writers transplants herself, rooting into a deeper partnership with nature than ever before. Well, if you've ever moved away from a beloved garden, or if there's a move in your future, you will probably find Paige's book to be especially appealing. Uprooted is Paige's story about leaving behind her beloved iconic garden at Duck Hill, a landscape that she molded and refined for 34 years. Now, the new property covers 17 acres of fields and woodland in northwestern Connecticut. The rolling land surrounds a Methodist church, and that is what inspired Paige to call her new space Church House. How does a seasoned gardener at age 74 start again? How does said gardener leave behind a beloved home and garden and stay open to new possibilities? Well, Uprooted gives us the chance to learn those answers as we follow Paige through all the major milestones as she discovers her new home place. We'll hear all about her home search, how she established her new garden spaces, and some of her revelations as she learns to evolve yet again as a gardener. If you've ever wondered how on earth you'll ever leave your garden, Paige will give you hope. And if you're thinking about revamping an old garden space or starting a new garden, you can learn from Paige how to create a garden that will bring you joy. As an accomplished garden writer, Paige's book is a fabulous read, and the photography is top-notch. And although the move from Duck Hill marked a horticultural turning point in her life, Paige surprisingly found herself excited and energized by her brand new space at Church House. This book is 244 pages of the evolution of a gardener as she transitions from Duck Hill to Church House, bringing with her lifelong love of nature, gardens, and landscape possibilities. You can get a copy of Uprooted by Paige Dickey and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $6. Great deal. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day, September 21st in 1947, that Stephen King, the best-selling American author of horror, supernatural fiction, suspense, crime, science fiction, and fantasy novels, was born. And in 1982, he stood for a photo by the famous gate to his property, known as the Spider Gate. It was custom made. It was made out of wrought iron. It was a Gothic masterpiece, and it featured spiders and ravens. So there you go, a little bit of property trivia for you about Stephen King. But I thought I'd end today's show with something fun, with some garden-related excerpts that I hand-selected from Stephen King's work throughout the years. And each of these quotes, as you listen to them, you'll notice they all have that little Stephen King edge. This first one is from his 1977 book, The Shining. His relationship with his father had been like the unfurling of some flower of beautiful potential, which, when wholly opened, turned out to be blighted inside. Here's an excerpt from his 1978 book, Night Shift. Having a breakdown was like breaking a vase and then gluing it back together. You could never trust yourself to handle that vase again with any surety. You couldn't put a flower in it because flowers need water, and water might dissolve the glue. Am I crazy then? Here's an excerpt from his 1984 book, The Eyes of the Dragon. I think that real friendship always makes us feel such sweet gratitude because the world almost always seems like a very hard desert, and the flowers that grow there seem to grow against such high odds. And here's one from It, from 1986. You could only protect your child through watchfulness and love, that you must tend a child as you tended a garden, fertilizing, weeding, and yes, occasionally pruning and thinning, as much as that hurt. And finally, here's an excerpt from The Institute from 2019. Might have done better to get rid of him, Annie said matter-of-factly. Plenty of room for a body at the far end of the garden. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.